Welcome to History Nerd Night Podcast. I'm your head nerd, Brendan. Thank you so much for being here. The movie Gladiator 2 is upon us, and I wanted to talk about gladiators. What do we think we know about them? What actually happened? Met a guy on Instagram, Alexander Mariotti. Wealth of information. I mean, once you hear this guy talk and the people that he's talked with, worked with, the shows that he's worked on, so legit. He's been on the History Channel. Everything you need to know that this guy is legit, it's all there. I was so excited to talk to him. It's a great conversation. So how about I just shut up? Let's talk to Alexander. And here we are with the Gladiator historian, Alexander Mariotti. Alexander, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you so much. It's an absolute pleasure to be here.
Now, this is a very specific, the Gladiator historian. How does that even start? Where did your love of gladiators in that time period come from?
Oh, well, I always say that gladiator historian is a fancy word for saying I had a lonely childhood, but it's more a case of probably looking back now, realizing that I've always lived in the shadow of the Colosseum. I think I was quite fortunate that my grandfather was born across the road from the Colosseum. And so it's been present in my life throughout my whole life. And I think that, you know, as kids, we always have an obsession maybe with medieval knights. For me, it was gladiators. I just loved playing in the Colosseum as a little boy with my brother. We used to play soccer, or football as we call it over here in Europe. And they fascinated me. And then they slowly, progressively became an important part of my life because it is the history that most fascinated me. I think they're the most enigmatic and enduring figures of history, without doubt.
And now, where did you grow up? So did you grow up just completely immersed in Rome? It sounds like you've also bounced around a lot, too. I mean, you seem to be not in one place for any too long a time.
No, well, actually, there's another fortune I had is that my parents were quite on the ancient Roman spectrum, and that my father could have been a good governor in antiquity because they stationed or traveled to different parts. So we went a little bit like the story of Gladiator. We went from Scotland to Rome to Africa, back to Europe. So yeah, very, very well traveled. But again, what was interesting was that the consistent thing throughout all the travels that we did was that Rome was always there. So it was always a connecting factor.
But when did you decide, right, like, I'm going to make this my job, right? For a lot of people, there's something that they find super cool and they read a lot about it, but you turned it into a career. When did you decide, hey, I'm going to make a real run at this?
Oh, you know, again, I think when I was younger, I was fascinated by it. When I was in my teenage years, I kind of felt it was an interesting topic because, again, it was everywhere I went, Rome was there. And so, you know, being suspended between two worlds as I was, being half Italian and half British, I kind of was never fully one thing. And yet I think Roman was a collection of all these things. And I was fortunate enough to, I have to say, fall into it. I'd love to tell you that there was some sort of master plan, but there's been a lot of serendipity in my life. And I've consistently found myself in the position of working in the historical world and just realized at a certain point that I was so lucky because it's a topic that has a lifelong career to it. You can never know everything. That's what's wonderful about it. And the challenge is to try and know everything, and yet you won't. And I think as time went on, just because of my experience with my sort of non-traditional experience in that I worked in film and television. I did a lot of sort of, you know, the period pieces. I became more fascinated with the weapons and the armor, and I got very hands-on about it. And I realized that a lot of the time when we read text and we talk to people, we're often talking about things that we've never experienced nor ever physically seen. And I had the opportunity to work on film sets and see massive battles pitched, you know, people wearing armor. I had the chance to actually work with a museum who rebuilt the weapons and find out the sort of biomechanics of how the fighting worked. And all this further fascinated me, always on the topic of gladiators. But I think it gave me a very unique perspective on it all.
I also don't want to pigeonhole you either. I mean, there's dozens of videos of you on YouTube. You've been on the History Channel because we're going to say gladiators and that's what we're going to focus on today. But you can't know gladiators without knowing Rome, like you've been talking about too, that greater part of it.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I just worked on a documentary and I was talking about Noah's Ark, the Sphinx. So, you know, my knowledge is fairly extensive, but I think because of the obsession with gladiators, it's a reoccurring theme that seems to come out. You know, there's certain moments we'll get interested in certain periods of history, you know, maybe because of politics, maybe because of fashion, maybe a film comes out and all of a sudden, you know, like the Spartans, right? All of a sudden 300 came out. Everyone wants to know about the Spartans, the Persian Wars. But outside of that, you don't really hear a great deal about it. Gladiators is a theme that keeps coming back. And I think because they are They are so enigmatic. They're so enduring. They're the underdogs of history. They're just the most, I think, compelling story. So that's why I keep getting asked to talk about them.
Before we jump into some of the stuff, and I've already warned you that I'm ready to go completely nerd out on the TV show
Spartacus.
I'm going to go full Spartacus. But before we do that, just some baseline stuff for people. People know gladiator, they know that word.
Yes.
What is the time period that we're talking about when we say gladiators the way we know them?
The way we know them? Wow, that's a good question. I would probably argue that already by about 27 BC, when Augustus is fully emperor, to about the 400s AD is the time period we're talking. So they do last a good, 450, almost 500 years of history. And as a sport, that's quite a lengthy career.
And now this is something else, and you have a video where you break all of these down. When we say gladiator, there's different types of gladiator too. It's not just like you're a gladiator, that's what it is, that's what you are. There was a bunch of different types as well, right?
Yeah. And just by the way, to go back to your earlier question, I actually argue that gladiators have always been with us through our history. I mean, for me, the earliest example of gladiators is in the Iliad. I think there's been sort of various components of what made gladiatorial sport ever present. And I don't think they go away because I think they have to do with human nature. In fact, I think, not to go on a tangent, but one of the things about gladiators is that they embodied a great philosophy of the Romans. The Greeks had a philosophy called arete, which meant excellence in what you did. But the Romans believed in virtus, and virtus was martial skill. It was physical and mental endurance. And the gladiators embodied that. They were sort of created out of different components from Greek sports, from funerary rites, but they became this incredible symbol. And what's interesting is that I think that if you look at UFC fighting, it is virtus. So virtus is such a fundamental thing to us that we keep trying to invent it in some way. And even if we don't speak about it, it's ever present in our culture.
And so then how many different types of gladiators, when we'll say, because as you're saying, like they're forever, but when we're talking about kind of the Roman gladiators that we know.
Oh, yes.
It was different types. It wasn't just like you're a gladiator, that's it.
No, they were different types. There were different classifications. They really were mixed martial artists. It was really the first, I would say, true MMA. So there was, people argue between 20 to 30 different types of gladiators. I mean, we have some sort of mainstays that were the most popular, and people would probably recognize them if they saw a picture. I would say the most famous is the Retiarius, because he's the only gladiator that didn't have a helmet. So, his looks were part of the sort of charm of him. He had a net and trident, so a very particular series of weapons. And he would fight against someone like a secutor, sometimes someone known as a mormillo. And these guys were quite heavily armored. They had very iconic helmets, very sort of powerful physiques. So because there was different types, when you actually became a gladiator, your trainer, your doctore, would look at you and choose what kind of discipline you would go into, because he would physically look at you and say, okay, you've got quite the, maybe you're tall, lengthy, you're quite sort of quick, you'd make a good Retiarius. Or maybe you're a little bit bulkier, you're a little bit slower, but you're powerful, you're like a heavyweight, you'd make a great mormillo.
Interesting. So when we're talking about nowadays, I think everyone's going to say, oh, when you're talking about gladiators, they're thinking of Russell Crowe, the movie Gladiator. Let me ask the question this way. Is it easier to list all of the things that Gladiator gets right, or is it easier to list all of the things that it gets wrong?
Well, you see, the thing is, I think there's a mistake in that we think it gets things wrong. It doesn't, because it's never intended to tell a story. I've been fortunate enough to work with Ridley Scott. He's not a historian. He has an interest in history, but I think there's been a big problem, especially with, if you look at Napoleon, the sort of how Napoleon was so historically inaccurate. It was never going to be. And the same with Gladiator. There's nothing wrong with it because it isn't a documentary and it's not presenting itself as such. What's right about it is that it gives us a glimpse into a world that we, until that moment, tried to picture. Again, I grew up around the Colosseum, but the first time I actually saw the Colosseum come to life, the first time I saw what the Colosseum looked like, or the Colosseum filled with spectators or gladiators fighting to the roar of the crowd, was in Gladiator. And I would say that's true of probably everybody. So they get a lot right, and they don't get very much wrong, because there is no actual historical basis to the story.
All right, I've held off long enough. I want to talk about the series Spartacus. Back in the day, one of my favorites. There's a lot of cool stuff about it, and you got to work on it. Can you tell me, how did you get involved with it, and what did that process look like for you on a day-to-day basis?
These things always sound very glamorous until you find out that 99% of what I do is get ignored. I fast sort of realized this working on many productions where I was like, well, they didn't do this, they did that, and realized that, people who work in film and television are film and television people, and they're not historians, and they're not, academics. They're there to make a good show. So my thing is to always try and get as much right as possible. And a lot of times on series such as Spartacus, what I do is I work maybe in the British Museum looking at that time period and getting images of weaponry, of set pieces. I basically try and help create that world and get it as much right as possible. So my thing is to try and get as much right as possible, knowing that most of it will get mixed and matched, that there'll be a lot of things that won't make sense, that will be historically accurate, but I can deal with it. So a lot of the things that you see in the series Spartacus actually come from real statues or relics, or actually people go to the British Museum, don't realize that they're actually looking at tons of things they've seen in Spartacus or even other shows. Very famously, there is a statue called the Togatus Barberini, which is a statue of a guy holding two busts. And that statue, which represented all the sort of imagery and the sizing for it, became the statue of Batiatus in the middle of the villa, which is now in my office here in Rome. And so basically I try and give the inspiration, the historical inspiration and basis to create that particular period of history that they're trying to depict.
Now, there's a lot of things to love about that show. Tons of sex and violence. Everybody loves that. But what I also notice about that is knowing the story of Spartacus.
Yeah.
A lot of stuff is made up, but the larger pieces of his life are in there. Actual historical stuff. So you have a very healthy, I think, look at it where it's like, hey, it's TV. I'm not worried about the realism. Is there anything that you've kind of worked on where you're like, please get this specific thing right? If I see this wrong on TV, it's going to drive me nuts.
No, not that specifically. Not that specifically. I mean, you're talking about Spartacus. It's funny because if you say who's the most famous gladiator of all times, they'll say Spartacus, but Spartacus was never a gladiator. He never actually fought. He was destined to. He was, being trained, but he didn't actually fight, as far as we know. So it's quite funny that the whole series is about a gladiator called Spartacus who was never a gladiator. But you're right. In broad strokes, there's a lot that they got right. And I think you have to applaud the fact that they used a lot of his tactics. I don't know if you remember, but when they were in Vesuvius, they put up corpses to distract the soldiers. So they thought that they were still up there camping. Whereas Spartacus's men made his way down the volcano, go around and attack them from the back. And you see that in the show. And I thought that was brilliant. Because the thing is that when you read history, there's so many incredible events that you don't really need to make stuff up.
Yeah, and I mean, what I loved about the show especially was, to me, the final season, I felt as a viewer, and for those who haven't seen it, I'm not going to try and ruin it for you, but basically the quote-unquote big bad of the last season is not a villain. The show lets you see that this is just a guy whose job it was to take down Spartacus, and instead of making him just this bad guy who's just murdering people and he's terrible, he's just basically a very rich soldier doing his job. What I love about that is, first of all, as far as we know, a lot of the history ends up the way it would end up. But what I really loved about that show was that ability and willingness to not talk down to the audience and show somebody, especially that you can say, sure, he's the enemy of the guy we're rooting for, but he's just the guy who's trying to do what he's been tasked with doing, which I really enjoyed.
Yeah. There's always a tendency to make the Romans the bad guys, aren't there? Any film you watch, even Gladiator, the Romans are rarely the good guy. I think they've gone down in history as the bad guys, even though we have great admiration for them. But yeah, I thought they did a truly tremendous job of the relationships. I thought the acting was brilliant. I mean, there's just some bits that really just haunt you. And even by the sort of last season, there was a couple of really touching moments. It's also interesting that, again, on the whole, they did make a story about a guy who probably was not as savory or heroic as we make him out to be. He probably was not a very savory character, Spartacus. He definitely was not this noble, peacemaking guy who just wanted to save everybody. He was pretty selfish and his men were pretty brutal. But I think there was moments where they kind of showed that part too. In between, of course, everybody fighting half naked in the snow and,
I mean, who hasn't? I mean, that's what I was doing last week.
Right. Yeah. The Spartans were renowned for walking around in just, subligoclum and underwear, just walking around the snow with their cloaks.
Now, I think an important part to talk about, and you can look at your social media, is you did make at least one very good friend out of Spartacus in Manu Bennett, he's awesome in everything he's in. But how did that kind of build, right? Because like you said, a lot of it is, hey, you do this research, you send it in, but how did you interact with the actors to the point that you could be friends with them?
Well, I've been very lucky to remain friends with a good handful of them, actually. And a lot of the times what happens is when you work on the shows, you get to, you talk to the actors and they're, you become a little bit of a Google for them, sort of a person that you can have conversations with. And so they might want to ask you, like, what would you do in this particular scene? Or what would somebody or this character behave in this sort of way? I did that quite recently with a series called The Chosen, which is quite popular in America at the moment. I don't know if you know of it. It's a multi-episode series about the life of Christ. And so we filmed a couple of documentaries where the chap who played Jesus or some of the actors who played the apostles actually came to Rome, and I took them to the sites and I gave them an entrance into that world and told them little things that maybe, they might find interesting and use in their acting. So a lot of the times that happens where I actually get to spend time with the actors and just have conversations and sort of be on call for them to say, look, I was looking at this scene and I was thinking, would he really behave this way, or would it depends on the actor. But then, these relationships develop. And so you'll find that a lot of the times they actually become really fascinated by the history because they embody the person. And from my point of view, it's quite an interesting aspect because I get to meet somebody who sometimes believes they are fully that character, And so you suspend reality for a moment and think, well, if I did have the indomitable Gaul Crixus with me right now, what would I ask him? How are you feeling? What are you thinking? And so I it's quite reciprocal as a friendship.
Now, have you ever thrown on some armor and ended up in a scene?
Oh, you're going to make me give away secrets. Yes. I have certain things about me which I think sound interesting and then might sound maniacal. I'm probably the only historian who's been stabbed with a gladius in the hand. I have a lovely scar on my hand and part of a bone that came dislodged because I got stabbed up. I spent a long time working on a lot of productions where productions are cheap most of the time. They're always complaining about budget. So an extra person on set doing nothing usually ends up. So I will tell you that my Easter eggs exist in that some shows actually have me in them. So you might catch them. So if you watch the series Rome, you'll see me. A few things. I've been in a few things now. I was sneak in, but yeah.
Yeah. So listeners, head to IMDb and see if you can find Alexander. No,
they're not listed. They're purposely not listed.
Well, no, then they have to watch everything that you're listed with and try and find you in it.
Oh, yeah. Sometimes I'm third spear from the back, but sometimes, yeah, you do see me. I actually just worked on a show called Those About to Die with Anthony Hopkins. It's going to come out. I think it's going to be really big. Great series, all about the Colosseum. So, yeah, you'll see me perk up in that at some point in some armor.
Now, if I said to you, who are your top 3 favorite gladiators of all time, do you have that list ready? Is that something that you could give us right now?
Wow. I would probably have to say a guy called Crescens, who survives in graffiti from Pompeii, and then Priscus and Verus, who are 2 gladiators who fought the opening of the Colosseum and gave such an incredible battle that they made their way into a poem that still survives today that talks about the fights. I think the 2 gladiators that were at the opening games of the Colosseums, that's pretty amazing. It's funny because most of the time gladiators are nameless to us, because we say, who's the most famous gladiator? And some might say Spartacus. No, he was never a gladiator, or, Russell Crowe's character. But we have a long list of names that survive through funerary monuments and through some scriptures and poems.
So I want to do some myth busting. Let's start with the biggest one right off the bat.
Yes.
Gladiator battles always ended in death. True or false?
No, false. No, why would they? That makes no sense. You'd have to train somebody, feed somebody, make them famous, and then they die, because they tripped over their sandals and somebody stabbed them in the back. No, a fight to the death was the absolute exception, not the rule. It was a very rare event.
Okay, along with that, at the end of a battle, the emperor might give a thumbs up or a thumbs down, and that meant whether or not it was to the death. True or false?
No. At the end, the emperor would decide who won, or the editor, which is the person who put on the games, would decide who won. And the whole thing about thumbs is a misunderstanding because we have a term listed in which it says pollicis verso cum iubit occat in popularite, which means that the thumb was pressed and the signal was given. But we don't know what that means, a pressed thumb. So the reason we think it's a thumbs up is because there was a black and white movie called, I think, Gladiators and Madonnas. I think it's a 1920s movie. And in that movie, the director decided that if this was good, this was bad, because this has always been good. And it's actually an ancient symbol. I'm holding a thumb up. And so people who make movies work in the movie industry. Those movies inspired people who made, like Kubrick, who made Spartacus and kept the thumbs up and thumbs down. And that generation was Ridley Scott's generation, who grew up watching Kubrick and then made Gladiator. And guess what they did? Thumbs up or thumbs down. But the likelihood is that a thumb was pressed into the fist, because we have a piece of terracotta that shows an editor pressing his thumb. And so the thumb down might have been they didn't win or death, but we're not sure. But the movies do a good job of confounding it.
Okay, next one. A gladiator could be so awesome he was granted freedom.
Yes. That's why slave gladiators were such good gladiators. They had an incentive. They could win their freedom. They could physically win their freedom. Although there are times that a freedom was granted. We know that freedom was granted and the gladiators refused and said, "Why would I? I am the toast of the empire. What would I do with freedom?" There's a great, I think, misunderstanding of, again, it probably goes back to the question you asked about gladiators. What is a gladiator? Because they did have condemned criminals that fought to the death. So these people that fought to the death tended to be people who were basically condemned to death. And they were not given training and they were not, wearing fancy armor, but they're not gladiators. I think later what happens is, especially Christian writers, confound what are called noxi, which are prisoners of war or criminals condemned to death, professional gladiators and professional hunters, the bestiarii. And they kind of shove them together. And what that does is creates the image we have of gladiators. If you ask anybody, who are poor slaves thrown in the arena, made to fight animals and people to death for the joy of the Romans. And they're not. They're three very distinct classes of different things. A gladiator, when I talk about a gladiator, I'm talking about a professional, top-of-the-range athlete.
The last one goes along with what you just said. Gladiators fought animals in the arena.
No, hunters fought animals in the arena. They were professional hunters, and they tended to actually be professional hunters or hunters by trade from different parts of the empire that then were so exceptional they were brought into the arena. For the Romans, the arena was everything. It's funny how much we take for granted what we have. We can sit on a couch and we can travel any part of the world. We can see any scene we want because we have television. We have not only television, now we have devices that do that let us see the world through them. But 2,000 years ago, the only thing you had was the Colosseum to enter into that world. And the Colosseum was a way for a Roman who didn't travel very much to see the rest of the known world. But also it kept people in check, because when you saw a lion, lions are not native to Rome. They don't roam around the city. But there was one in the middle of the city. And yet, in the same way we voyeuristically sit on a couch and voyeuristically watch people fight to the death or go on epic adventures without actually being in danger, so too was a Roman sitting in the Colosseum comfortably on a cushion with his friends, having, food and wine and not really being a danger, but sensing that danger and realizing that there was a danger outside. But then there was the heroic hunter who fought. How brave. A lion, a panther, a bear, and then killed them right in front of you. And it was to inspire you. And in the same way that there was two guys wearing helmets, fighting with these incredibly dangerous weapons, but they stared at death at the face. They weren't afraid of it. So there was always the possibility that a gladiator could die from a wound, because they were fighting with weapons after all, from infection, but they still did it. And how, inspirational that was to a Roman.
Now, when we're talking about gladiator battles, and you've kind of already talked about this, there was a lot of different things that could happen during these events.
Yeah.
Do we know how long these things happened? Was this like a 3-day bender we went on and it ended with like a gladiator fight in the last event?
No.
Or was it all mixed up and depended on what was going on that day?
Well, actually, I think that most of your audience will find what I'm about to say quite familiar, which was that it was an all-day event. You would go there and you'd sit down and there'd be sort of like an opening ceremony. There was a parade called a pompa in which you had music playing. So you had an orchestra playing music in the Colosseum. You're there with your friends. You're sitting down. There's music. There's an announcement going on. Then you have a wonderful parade. So you've got the guys coming out of the dugouts, from the far reaches of Africa. Carpophorus, the hunter, killer of beasts, slayers of, the most monstrous animals you've ever seen. And then out he came and people cheered. And then you had the animal hunts after the parade, in which these incredible sets and scenery came out of the floor of the Colosseum. And when you go to visit the Colosseum today, there's the ruins of the Hypogeum, which was the 2 layers of trapdoors and lifts. I mean, it was basically a working theater / cinema where trees would pop out of the ground and then disappear again. So you'd have entire forests appear. And then animals would pop out of trapdoors and hunters would fight. And then you had the halftime show. And you'd have music and you'd have a raffle. So you could actually win things. People would throw stuff called missilia, which we call missiles today. So they were objects, they were tokens. You could win stuff. There was free food and wine. And then afterwards, around about, I'd say about 4 o'clock. So when the sun started to set down and the temperature was a bit more agreeable, you'd have your gladiators, and it would start with the lesser known guys, the build-up fights right up to the title fight, which is what you want to see. And what's funny is that if you go to a football game today, that's exactly the progression of the game. And it isn't because someone in the NFL said, oh, I just read a historical book and I thought, what a great idea. It's because, which is so fascinating, we in the last sort of, I would say 80 years have started to build amphitheaters again that house thousands of people. Because, 500 years ago, we didn't have 20,000 or 80,000 spectator stadiums. We have them today, and we had them back then. And all of a sudden, as time has progressed through the history of American football, that's the progression of the games. Let's start with the opening show. Let's start with the guys come out of the dugouts. Let's start with the game. Then we have the halftime show. And then and even if you go see a UFC, it's the same thing. So I think it's a very organic, natural procession.
Now, if I can send you back in time, right? Doesn't have to be a gladiator. Maybe it's a type of person. If I could magically send you back in time, who is somebody that you would need to have a conversation with for an hour?
Oh, geez, I wrestle with these at different times. I have these conversations because I have them in my mind. The great thing about Romans is that they're still here. I spend a lot of time around monuments, around statues, and I talk about these people. And I think how incredible that 2,000 years later, like if you take someone like Marcus Aurelius, their words are still there. Even Caesar, you read Caesar's own words, his books, and you think they are still very much present. Statues, for example, Roman statues, because people were illiterate, are geared to tell you something. The Romans are a fascinating civilization because they're still very present. They still have a lot to tell us. I think they still have a lot to teach us about the future. And so there's many times that I'll be reading something that they said and have a sort of conversation of how someone could come to that conclusion. But I'd probably, it's a hard one. That's one of the hardest questions. Recently, probably Caesar, because I always tend to think a lot about Caesar this time of the year. But otherwise, it'd probably be Marcus Aurelius, I think.
All right, let me give you another really tough one. Somebody's flying through Europe. They have a stopover in Rome. They've only got time to do one thing in Rome. What should they do?
Oh, that's easy. Climb the steps of the Capitoline Hill and overlook the Forum. It's the most magical place in the world. I don't think there's a place like it. And it's you get a sort of aerial view almost of the ruins of the Imperial Forum and the Forum Romanum. And I think when you're there, you'll be fascinated because it really is unique in the world as a location. The thoughts you think there, you will not think anywhere else. When you see what's left of a once great civilization, there's no place that's more sobering on the fragility of civilization itself, on society, on power, on all these things that we give importance to that ultimately are so fickle. And you only get that when you see the Forum, but you'll just be overwhelmed by its beauty. So that's an easy one. And you can see the Colosseum from it. So 2 in 1.
Now, there's a hidden gem I saw you do a video on, so I want you to talk about that, the Ludus Magnus. What is that? Tell me about it.
Oh, it's the great gladiator school of Rome. It's the one site nobody pays any attention to. Well, I mean, why would you? It's, the Colosseum's right there in front of you. It's just a little pile of brick walls, but it was the school of the gladiators. It was the training camp. And when you go there and you find out about it, it's where you start realizing that everything you think you know about gladiators, you don't. I always say it's where the myth of gladiators dies and the truth begins, because you go there and you start realizing, wait, they had homes, they had they had apartments, they had like actual a miniature Colosseum where they trained. There's a tunnel that led underground to the Colosseum, and you're thinking, this is a lot of stuff. You find that they had doctors on site, and you think, wait, weren't they going to kill these guys? Why have they got doctors that they're paying? It's a wonderful location. I wish they'd do more with it. I think half the problem with Rome is that they don't really take a great care of the history that's here. and they don't have a lot of imagination when it comes to actually developing these sites.
Now, Alexander, there are, and I talk about them every podcast episode, there are misguided people who think history is boring. If I sat one of those people in front of you and they said, why should I learn about gladiators? Haven't I learned enough about history in high school? What would you say?
Well, I'd say that history is boring in school, but it's not history's fault. It's the people who present it. I think history is quite easily the most fascinating of topics. I mean, the reason I find it fascinating is because it actually explains why you are the way you are, why you do the things you do. You know, a lot of people sort of meander through life without realizing that your life is actually influenced and dictated by people like Caesar and Augustus. You know, I can give you a very simple example. Previous to Caesar, there was only 10 months to the year. A calendar is something that we use every day of our lives. And I guarantee you that we're probably taught it at the age of 5, and yet no one takes the time to teach us the names of the calendar months and what they mean. And I think that's ridiculous. There's people who spend their whole lives using something they know nothing about. So the last 4 months of our calendar are September, October, November, December. So we have a physical reminder in the names of the months that there was only 10 months to the year. Now, why that changed is because Julius Caesar was a genius of marketing. And for those of you in America, and I don't want to get political because I'm not political, I'm a historian, so I love history. I don't want to get political, but there is politics in history. If you think anything new about what you're experiencing politically this year, the last 4 years, or the next 4 is new, then I would suggest you read about Caesar. You read about that period and find that actually it's not. Caesar was a genius of marketing and understood that there was a great relationship between power and pleasure. And he knew how to win people. He would build structures like his own forum to show people power, a physical embodiment of it. But he would also do things to give people pleasure. For example, he invented a whole month, which is still named after him, July. And because he did this, and it became very popular, because as a month it's great, and you have holidays, that after his death, his nephew came to power. And just to show people who think history is boring, people know more history than they think they do, because everybody knows that after Julius came Augustus, because everybody in the world knows that after July comes August. So our calendar teaches us history from the moment we're 5 years old and we're taught our calendar month. And Augustus did the same and created a holiday month. And so still today, people go on holiday when? In July and August, not just because the weather's great, but because these two guys knew how to seduce people 2,000 years ago.
Alexander, this was all fantastic. Thank you so much for coming on and talking about it.
Thank you so much, Brendan. What an absolute pleasure.
And that's it for this episode. Alexander, thank you so much. Make sure you follow Alexander on his socials. The Gladiator Guide is his Insta handle. Definitely hit him up. Definitely follow him. His videos are awesome. Follow us on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook. Don't forget the YouTube channel. Until next time, nerds, stay cool.
History Nerds United.